Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Hopkins Centre Bold Ideas, Better Solutions 2021, Session 1, Participation with Dignity in Life Domains. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that I'm speaking from, the Turrbal and Jaguar peoples, and pay my respects to their elders, and past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. Dignity is such a abstract word, but such an important context in the meaning of human rights. I believe dignity is a cornerstone of all human rights principles. And as Graeme will probably speak much more articulately to this, but it was very clear when the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities were being developed. I had the great honour to be at the final ad hoc meeting, but Graeme had the great honour to be at all of those meetings representing Australia in his formal role as the Human Rights Commissioner and the Acting Disability Discrimination Commissioner. And correct me if I'm wrong later. But what the CRPD says that the rights of persons with disability, which is the International's commitment to the inherent dignity and worth and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. Without these rights and freedoms set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights, dignity is amplified in a way that recognising that discrimination against any person on the basis of disability is a violation of the inherent dignity and worth of that human person. For people with disabilities, we still are a long way from living life free from discrimination. And we only have to look at some most recent events that have occurred here in Australia. The first with the vaccination rollout in COVID, where people with disabilities who were Tier 2 or A2 were, and particularly those that who were being served in the NDIs and living in group homes, there were access to that vaccination was put on hold while other groups were being vaccinated. And I noticed today that still level B were only 70% vaccinated, which is still lower than the other, level C, which is 80% vaccinated. The other area, of course, is the recent regulation of silver standards under the National Construction Code. And the New South Wales Minister for Housing still has not agreed to adopt that standard. What this demonstrates is we have all these plans, action plans, and for people with disabilities that talk about the inclusion of people with disabilities in our social and economic participation. But the evidence of those two small examples still demonstrate that we are being discriminated against and that we are not fully realising and cannot live our lives with dignity in every aspect of social, economic, cultural, and civil and political participation. And that is, and so I'm now starting to be very cynical and think that we're operating in a world of mirrors where inclusion is an illusion for people with disabilities in the context of the government, whose obligations are there to protect, respect, and fulfill our human rights, and particularly that we can live life with dignity. I now hand over to David. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for opening the session today. My name is David Trembath. I am the session chair for today. I'm joining you from the land of the Kumba people, speakers of the Yugambeh language, and I acknowledge elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's my pleasure to now introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Graeme Innes AM, lawyer, author and company director. Following Graeme's address, will be an in-focus conversation with Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer, Director of the Policy and Innovation Hub, Griffith University, and member of the Law Futures Centre. Thank you, Graeme.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Kevin. And it's great to be with you all here. And I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking, which is Bundjalung land, not far south of you in Tweed Heads. We've all caught a bus at some time in our lives. They carry about 50 people. On such a bus, the diversity represented as it is in the Australian population, 10 or 11 of those people would be people with disabilities. So why is that not obvious to you when you get on that bus? Well, there's a few reasons. First, many disabilities are hidden. You can't see hearing impairment, autism or cognitive disability, acquired brain injury or epilepsy, just to name a few. People with physical or mobility disability, people who use service dogs, are the standouts, but our proportion in the disability population is quite low. Second, we're not on the figurative bus. There are a number of reasons for this. In the busload of politicians, we're almost not there at all. Jordan Steele, John, is a rare example where we are. In the busload of senior public servants, it's the same. The two senior federal public servants I can think of are rare exceptions. And there are few state public servants, such as my friend Kevin Cox, who opened this seminar. You don't see us on the television bus. Screen Australia research in 2016, and it hasn't changed much since that time, confirmed that people with disabilities represent just 4% of characters on screen, while we comprise more than 20% of the population. Our sports are now a little more in focus. Kurt Fernley and Dylan Alcott are probably well known on our screens. And we appear more in comedy, people like Stella Young, Hannah Gadsby, and Adam Hills. And we start to appear a little more in current affairs and news commentary. Rick Morton being one, Samantha Connor from People with Disabilities Australia, and perhaps myself. But again, it's rare. This was the story of women 20 or 30 years ago. It's still the story of people who are culturally or linguistically diverse to some extent. And it's definitely the story of people with disabilities right now. But we're still out there in the community, getting on with our lives. And surprisingly to many in the community, we want to contribute to the community, but we can only be included in the community if the community lets us be included. That dignity that Kevin spoke about earlier this morning is all important. The Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, both of which Australia is a signatory, mandate inclusion. The Disability Discrimination Act, a federal law, mandates inclusion through its objectives, and the second reading speech of Deputy Prime Minister Brian Howe makes this extremely clear. It is mirrored by legislation in each state and territory. States and territories have also enacted disability services legislation, or in some cases disability inclusion legislation. And most of those laws include objectives or other provisions around inclusion. So the legal framework is there, but sadly, the reality is not. Because, to quote famous French jurist and human rights lawyer René Cassin, it would be deceiving the peoples of the world to let them think that a legal provision was all that was required, when in fact an entire social structure had to be transformed. Later in this seminar on participation with dignity, you will hear from some very well qualified experts in their particular fields. I don't want to cut across what they have to say in those fields. Instead, I want to give you some very practical guidelines, and if we could screen share the slides I've provided now, please, about participation with dignity for people with disabilities. One of the many examples of ways that we want to be included in the community is to be consulted about the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the scheme available for a small number of us, about our changing Medicare benefits, about those national infrastructure projects and where they'll be built. Think about Brisbane and the Olympic Games, and hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit later on. About our treatment as asylum seekers and refugees, because some of us are. About our acceptance as immigrants to Australia, because some of us are. And about how we have been treated during COVID and why we are vaccinated at a rate, I thought it was 15% less, Kevin, you suggested 10, behind the general population, but the figure doesn't matter. It's the fact that we are behind the rate when we're a priority group that's important. And that's just to name a few areas. I'm sure that most of you want to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, and that's why you're at this seminar. And if I'm right, then you need to know how to include us, because we want participation and we want it with dignity. So here's some short stature people, and one of them should be on the screen now, with some rules to help you to support inclusion. This is grumpy, and experts can be grumpy, but not always. But people with disabilities are experts in our lived experience. So value that expertise when you are consulting and developing policy, and doing so with dignity, because that lived experience expertise really matters. Next slide, please. This is dopey. Now, just like men, women, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, disabilities are different. I can't tell you the number of times that Professor Ron McCallum and I have been confused. I'm a bit taller than him. He's a bit older than me. He's a law professor, and I'm a company director and was with the Human Rights Commission. But people come up to me in this, and I use a guide dog and he uses a white cane. But people come up to one of us in the street and assume we're the other just because we happen to be people who are blind. Next slide, please. Sometimes disempowerment can be mistaken for bashfulness. That's why we've got bashful here. So, but when you're working with people with disabilities, if you want us to participate with dignity, you need to account for the different ways we operate. If you hand out a piece of paper at a meeting, make sure that everyone can read it. So send it in Braille or electronically. Tapping a microphone and saying, "Can everyone hear me?" in a seminar, and we will get back to those eventually, one hopes, of course, immediately excludes a person with a hearing impairment who can't hear you ask that question. So consult respectfully and think about your audience. Next slide, please. This is sneezy, and in COVID times, a sneeze has an impact. Disability has an impact as well. So it's really important to take into account that some people with disabilities will have more of a challenge getting up in the morning than many of us. It's important to take into account the lack of available taxis and how much harder it is for some people with disabilities to travel. So rule 4, think about disability and its impact when you're dealing with policy development. Next slide, please. This is Doc, and he's telling us about rule number 5. For treatment, you need the doctor, not the receptionist. So talking to organisations that provide us with services is not talking to people with disabilities. You need to talk to people with disabilities or our organisations. In other words, nothing about us without us, which has been the catchphrase of the disability movement over the last decade or so. Next slide, please. This is happy. People with disabilities are consulted a lot. Generally, we're happy, but just like everyone else, sometimes we're not. But recognise that people with disabilities are consulted a lot and think about what the quid pro quo for having us participate is. You know, consultation, policy development is a transaction, and there are two sides to any transaction. So what can a person with a disability get? Is there a fee for the consultation, a value put on their expertise? Will the notes be provided to them? Will they be advised of the outcomes from that consultation? Next slide, please. This is Sleepy, of course, and you wouldn't use sexist or racist language during interactions. So using ableist language is just as disrespectful as racism and sexism, and reinforces the disadvantage experienced by people with disabilities. So rule number 7, language matters. Don't say that someone is blind to the issue or deaf to your concerns. Don't describe a challenge as insane. That's why I call these people that we've seen on the slides people of short stature, not the more commonly used name. Next slide, please. So thanks very much for the chance to speak with you today. I look forward to my conversation with Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer and to hopefully answering some of your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Graeme. Hello, everybody. My name's Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer. I'm going to be taking a wonderful opportunity to interview Graeme about some of the lessons, the very, very useful lessons he's just outlined for us that is relevant to all people who engage in research, policy or law reform. And I must say, I'll never think about Snow White the same way, Graeme. I love that. I'm welcoming everybody to put their questions in the Q&A, which I have in front of me. And while people are doing that, I might start with a question about your recent role as an ambassador at the Disability Virtual Expo, which I was very excited to see, because I'm very interested in what risks to dignity and participation technology might pose for policy around people living with disabilities, the whole e-government push. Are there threats? What governance precautions are needed?
Well, firstly, Susan, I think it's important to say that there are huge opportunities. So technology can be a real enabler for people with disabilities. But the threats are in the design of the technology, I think, and in the fact that poor designers design things to work for themselves. Good designers design things to work for everyone. And so lots of technology, lots of websites and places like that don't comply with the WCAG 2 rules so that they're not accessible for everyone. They can be, and the technology allows that if people take that into account. And that's the general rule across the board, I think, really for technology, is back to the design. The classic example, apart from websites, that comes to my mind is when the Commonwealth Bank brought out an EFTPOS machine, which only had a touch screen. It was called the Albert, and it was advertised as the most U-Butte next best piece of technology, but anyone who couldn't see the screen couldn't use that piece of technology. And with the addition of a keypad, that would have resolved all the problems. So that was the example of sort of poor design that's the real threat.
I think that's right. And I guess we've seen some issues around algorithms too in relation to how that's used in terms of the transparency of these types of decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, looking at your 7 dwarves, there's such a failure of creative imagination, of empathy, even of logic, isn't there? Like, what you're suggesting seems so reasonable to me. Why do we get it wrong so often, Graeme? Why?
Yeah. Well, I think in society, we all have a level of unconscious bias. So we think about society being like ourselves. And so if we want to include everyone, we have to actively address unconscious bias. And that's why we have diversity programs. That's why we look at the members of boards or the members of committees or the members of staff of an organisation to test the diversity, to make sure that we're not getting just appointing more people just like us, because it's such an easy thing to do for all of us. And those of us who don't do it are the ones who are successfully working against that default position. So I think that's what it boils down to, and that's whether you're talking about people from non-English speaking backgrounds, people with disabilities, women, people with a different sexual orientation. The same rule applies.
It's a very good insight. I often wonder whether it's time. People rush the design phase. I see in government all the time that, initiatives start fast. There's a lot of pressure to roll things out. And so that kind of crucial, deep consultation that really allows people to participate with dignity, it's rushed or it's just overlooked altogether.
Yeah, and when we rush, we go back to our default, which is, this is how I do it for me. And that's why we have to be really conscious of that unconscious bias that drives us.
Do you think that's what's happened in the COVID vaccination? And it seems bizarre to me that we have a Disability Royal Commission happening, and at the same time, the one job we have failed this year to achieve for disabled people. We couldn't have been more stark. You hear it in Kevin's voice, how stark this challenge was, and the consequences are so high. So what went wrong there? We had the target, but not what? The underpinning capacity to fulfill the target?
I think it always comes down to people, in my view. So we had the target, but the people who were responsible for the rollout and facilitating the rollout didn't have in their societal group people with disabilities. And so we just didn't have the priority. It's the same groupthink that you used to get in a group of men before women were included in whole areas of society, in boards, in certain professions. It's the same sort of logic that that allowed us to build huge numbers of public buildings that were inaccessible, or that had fewer toilets for women than toilets for men. Now, physiology tells you clearly that that's not going to work, but the people making those decisions didn't even turn their minds to that.
And still aren't. If you look at a lot of sporting infrastructure, that's going to be
true.
An issue.
That's true.
We have a question that's come through, Graeme, from one of the attendees. They have asked, how do we best address inaccessibility when it comes to software, especially when there is no flexibility around the particular software being used?
It comes back to, well, design originally, as I said, but there is software that's not designed appropriately. So it comes back to procurement. And whether we're talking about government or large organisations such as universities or other big employers, the key decisions are made when the procurement decisions are made. So we have to make sure that access is a key performance indicator in terms of what we procure, so that if the software is not accessible, we don't buy it. And governments have a huge role in this, because governments are such major purchasers of software that they can drive the market to accessibility. And the reason that we have such success with software such as Apple and Microsoft is because 25 years ago, the United States enacted a law which required procurement to be accessible. And so these companies had to fall into line, and we benefit from that. What we don't benefit from is perhaps the smaller manufacturers who haven't taken up that design because, again, they just haven't thought about it.
Thank you very much. It's very good. Keep your questions coming, everyone. And in the meantime, I'd like to ask you about thinking of the research community here that are listening. I'm really interested in, for researchers, as someone who's dealt with researchers a lot in your life and conducted and commissioned research, what have you seen go really well? What have you seen go really badly? So obviously, when people don't follow your precepts.
Well, yeah, I mean, the basic rule about research is very similar to the basic rule about inclusion, which is remember to engage with people with disabilities. If we're not involved at every step of the research, from design through to the end of the process, then that research is not, or the result of that research is not going to be accessible for people with disabilities. And I'm talking about people with disabilities across the board. Now, some people will say, well, that's really hard to involve people with disabilities in that sort of process. Yep, it is. No question about that. It is harder than just doing it the old way we've always done it, which is just working it out in terms of how it applies to ourselves. But it comes down to the question of whether you want the research to be applicable for 80% of the community or 100% of the community. And if it's the latter that you want, then the research needs to be inclusive and needs to be inclusive right from the start. There are some very useful guidelines around these days from a number of our Australian universities who've worked on inclusive research and involving people with disabilities, and particularly if the research is about us, but not only then, putting us at the centre of the process.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And I think I'll put some of those in the chat, actually, some of the best practice guides. But I think you're right, this idea of, as you said in your speech, people are the experts in their lived experience. I think part of what the Academy needs to do is recognise different types of expertise in that respectful way, and also compensate people for their time and effort. So I think that idea of there are many types of knowledge, different types of knowledge, and if we respect those types of knowledge, if we really respect them, then we'll conduct ourselves differently. I hope I've seen people in the Hopkins Centre do that differently, and I hope they're modelling that. There are many of our colleagues with disabilities who are academics who shouldn't have to bear the burden, I think, of reminding us all the time of how to do things properly. So I think that's something we've got to take on board and do that work. And our First Nations colleagues are always telling us the same story: do the work, do the work. No shortcuts. Yep. Do the work.
Yep, that's right.
I'm just seeing if there's any more questions. It doesn't look like it, so I get to ask the Olympics question, which I'm really excited. So, we didn't quite get where we wanted to on the Commonwealth Games on the Gold Coast in terms of disability rights, but there were some really wonderful moments with both the athletes and design. There was a bit of a big push for accessible tourism, but there is a moment, isn't there? And sometimes policy reform is about moments and the 2032 Olympics might present Brisbane with a moment to allow more participation with dignity in these very major events and investments. What do you think? What's your dream for what this moment might look like?
Well, the first thing I'd say about this moment is that this moment is now. Even though the Olympics are 12 years away, this moment is now. And we really learned that from our Sydney Olympic experience, that the time to design for everyone, instead of just the 80% of the community that doesn't have a disability, is right at the beginning. And you know, it's the same thread that's gone through the things that you and I have talked about, Susan, this morning, that right from the design stage, people with disabilities need to be included. And we have some very effective consultants with disabilities who can not only bring their lived experience of disability, but can bring their lived experience of participation as athletes, who can be very valuable to the Brisbane Olympics experience. We also have things like the access to premises standards, which are rules that govern how we make buildings accessible for everyone. And we have the access to transport standards, which do a similar thing. So it's applying those things right from the start, not trying to fix the problems later on when the damage is already done, when the building is half built or the transport plans have been made, but rather applying those approaches from the start of inclusion and co-design.
That sounds great. And I wish we could see what was in the bid document, and it would be easier to find out what we promised.
Yeah.
A way to find out what we deliver.
Yeah, well, that's true. But I'm sure there are people involved on the inside of the process with disabilities. So maybe reaching out to them and finding where those links are. But I agree with you. It'd be great to see what the bid document has in mind. But it's really all those little micro decisions in the next 12 years that will lead up to whether the Brisbane Olympics are accessible or not.
Such a good point. I think they're about to announce the organising committee, so that will give us a few advocacy targets to look at.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
There is a wonderful question in the chat for you. An attendee asks, can't large government drivers like the NDIs lever some of this significant systemic change in procurement and systems that are needed? For example, fighting for access to an iPad because it's an accessible communication tool seems like an enormous waste of energy and resources on the scale that is needed.
Well, the NDIS was a great dream when it came into effect, 8 years ago now, I think, and it was one of the really practical ways that we could drive inclusion, because we could facilitate far better support for people with disabilities, many of whom had never received any support, and also build up the Australian workforce in terms of the provision of that support. But it hasn't perhaps continued that way. And I think the reason for that is the lack of people with disabilities in senior leadership roles in the agency and on the board. Because, you know, as I've said, we need to be at the centre of the design of these processes. And people that have been making the decisions are politicians, government bureaucrats, and leaders in the National Disability Insurance Agency. And as the scheme has developed, the number of those who are people with disabilities has become fewer and fewer rather than more and more. And I think that's a big problem, because the issues that impact on people with disabilities aren't being called out. But, you know, it's not just the NDIS that needs to drive procurement. Governments in the Department of Main Roads in Queensland, in the Department of Agriculture, in the Department of the Attorney General and Justice, all need to take a focus which includes all members of the community, that is, including people with disabilities. Because without that approach, without that co-design, without that procurement, government won't really drive the access needs of people with disabilities. So the problem is in the NDIS. I agree, we need to make changes there, but it's a much broader problem than that.
It's a really good point. So we're waiting to see the new National Disability Strategy, aren't we? And you would hope that gives us a kind of a better overview of all the different areas in which, I mean, all areas of policy affect people with disabilities. But we don't have a strategy properly at the moment, do we?
We don't. I think it's going to be the Australian Disability Strategy because, you know, governments always have to change the name of things rather than the NDS, which it has been. But, you know, there's been a lot of those sorts of strategies around, Susan. But the key for those strategies is that they are resourced. It's very easy to develop a strategy and then leave it on a shelf. And one of the problems with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is really that Australia is not living up to all of the rights held by people with disabilities under that convention, because previous national disability strategies have been significantly under-resourced, and there hasn't been a mindset to apply them across the board. I think state governments have actually done better in that respect than federal governments, but in both areas there is lack of resource and misdirection of resources. You know, Kevin gave a couple of examples right at the start of this seminar. And the one that I would add is that in New South Wales, here where I am, the move has been made from COVID being a health issue to an economic issue with our change of premier. I'm not sure how you change a pandemic into an economic issue, but nonetheless, that seems to have been what's happened. And as a consequence of that, the Auslan interpreters who we had at every press conference are no longer there. So immediately, people who are deaf or have a hearing impairment are excluded from that really vital health information that we need. So yet again, people with disabilities are having to campaign to get something brought back, which has been taken away as a consequence of a decision that didn't take us into account.
That's absolutely scandalous, isn't it? I've just an open letter on that issue. I mean, it's what kind of precedent does that set? What, next bushfire season, will they decide we don't need Auslan interpreters for that? It's really terrible. And the response this morning was really average. If I think, oh, we'll provide interpreters as they're necessary, as if they're going to know, you know, they're always, if they're providing a daily update on a crucial health issue, then it's always necessary.
Then it's always.
I'd be very angry.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I share those views.
There's so much to make you angry at the moment, isn't there? I was thinking about what you were saying about the kind of the absence of people with disabilities on the senior leadership levels of the NDIS. That seems, again, such a core, basic Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities accountability. And your beautiful quote about, you know, just because it's law doesn't make it real.
René Casson, I love that quote, yeah.
Beautiful quote. So I guess I'm thinking about this idea of, I saw the new NDIS reform bill make some minor changes to that representation issue, but it probably doesn't go far enough. So what does it mean for, say, those of us in universities, those of us in hospitals, around that governance question? What should we be pushing for when it comes to the governance of our institutions? You know, what do you think are the most powerful advocacy arguments we should be making about this kind of governance level representation?
Well, you know, the old saying about anything is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that has really been the case for people with disabilities because we haven't been at the table in so many instances around governance in terms of things like the board of the NDIS, but also the boards of large companies, the boards of government regulators. Because we're not there, we're not visible on those boards, even though we're 20% of the population, 1 in 5, then decisions are being made that don't take account of our particular needs. And this is why the key question of diversity on boards and including more and more women on boards is so important and so critical, and including more people from non-English speaking backgrounds on boards. Because if you don't do that, you get decisions that relate to the people who are making them. And if all of those people are, as was the case in the past, older white men, then you're going to get decisions which reinforce privilege. And so that's why we need to change those situations and have more diverse governance functions. And at the corporate level, that's being recognised now, and a lot of work has been done to change the blend of people on boards. And we have probably not enough yet, but far more women on boards than there were. The same needs to occur from people from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, and for people with disabilities, if the decisions are going to reflect the view of the whole community.
I agree with that. I feel like if it really was a meritocracy, our boards, our places of power would represent the community. It would look like our demographics. Coming to the end of this lovely conversation, there was a last-minute question around, the difficulties of accessing the NDIS and making places like hospitals more inclusive. So that might be something we take on later. But I know you're off to a book launch. It's a wonderful book written by academics with disabilities about the NDIS. I'm going to make sure that goes in the chat, Graeme, so that people can access that book. Thank you so much.
Really, really useful piece of research.
Oh, it just looks fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm now going to hand back to David Trembaugh for the next panel.
Thank you so much, Graeme and Susan. That was a striking conversation and absolute compelling reasons why we need to do better. Graeme mentioned, people with disabilities are not on the bus. Susan talked about a failure of creative imagination and empathy. And then, Graeme, you mentioned that it always comes down to people. When we rush, we go back to what works for me, and that people with disability must be at the centre of the process. Thank you. I'm going to be reflecting on these thoughts as we go through the program, which leads us to the topic 1, how to enable dignified participation in mainstream settings, insights from data and research. We're going to start with a talk by Professor James Middleton, Clinical Director of the New South Wales State Spinal Cord Injury Service, followed by lightning talks by Ms. Kelsey Chapman, Dignity Project Research Lead and PhD candidate within the Hopkins Centre, Dr. Grace Bittner, Research Fellow within the Hopkins Centre, and Dr. Gary Allen, Chief Executive Officer of Enabled VIP. I'll now hand over to James. Thank you. Apologies all. We're going to have a brief break and we'll return shortly. Welcome back, everybody. So we begin topic 1, how to enable dignified participation in mainstream systems, insights from data and research. Our first speaker is Professor James Middleton, Clinical Director of New South Wales State Spinal Cord Injury Service. I'll now hand over to James. Thank you.
Close the door. Thanks, David, and thank you to Michaela and the organisers for the opportunity to speak to you today about how we're going about translating knowledge into practice from the Australian arm of our international spinal cord injury study. So as people may know, spinal cord injury has far-reaching effects, not just physical, but psychological and economic and beyond the person, involving the people that are close to the person, but also society. There's a lack of large population-based Australian studies that examine the lived experience, and it's important to understand the complex interaction between people with their environment, participation, their health, and how all of those things can be impacted by policy and practice. So the point of the research really is to develop targets to improve practice, health system management, policy changes, and so on, in terms of improving people's rights and funding and supports and life opportunities. So this study, what we call Ozinski, is part of, Australia was one of 22 countries, and this study is going to be repeated in 5 years. We recruited the second highest number of people, and get myself out of the way. The Ozinski study combined data from 11 data sources and 9 data custodians. It included 4 spinal cord injury services units in 4 Australian states, as well as a New South Wales Government Insurance Agency, iCare, who was also the funder, and 3 state-based spinal cord injury consumer organisations. And I'll come back to the importance of that. And we used an interesting methodology linking data through a third party that allowed us to develop a representative sample with good generalisability. The cohort is just under 1,600 adults with spinal cord injury across 4 Australian states. The majority were male. Sorry, the dog's just come in. An average age of 58. More people with paraplegia and incomplete lesions, and a broad range of lived experiences with an average post-injury of 17 years. And a third of people had low education levels, and 57% lived in capital areas. In metropolitan capital cities. And so this is the design I'll take you through quickly today. So in terms of collecting the data, explaining the findings, both in scientific terms, but also in lay terms, then asking participants, stakeholders, people with spinal cord injury, as well as other stakeholders, what the findings mean, how to interpret them, how to prioritise them, and how then to design implementation actions. And so in terms of collecting the data, we collected data based on the, as I said, an international protocol for the International Spinal Cord Injury Survey that included 125 questions based on ICF categories broadly around health, functioning in terms of activities and participation, environmental barriers, quality of life, but a range of other measures. And the Australian, we had a subset, an Australian module that also had an additional 68 items, so 193 questions in all, so very comprehensive. So I'm just quickly going to run through a few of the key results and then talk about some of our translation efforts. So here you can see that there are, these are the 10 most common health complaints along the bottom here, shown from left to right is levels of severity from none in the red, across mild, moderate, severe, and in the black on the right, extreme problems. And so you'll see on the bottom, from top to bottom, least to most complications. And so pain was the most common complication in 85% of people. And you'll see that a lot of people, around 40%, had severe or extreme levels of pain. Sexual dysfunction was the next most common problem. And you'll see, in fact, the black there, it had the most extreme level problems, 44%, and so on, spasms, sleep, bowel and bladder problems. So compared to a year ago, in terms of level of function and independence, people were better in about 20%, about the same in 60%, and worse in 20%. And in the last 4 weeks, in terms of problems, you'll see that there were a lot of people had, problems, and between 20 to 35% were in the severe to extreme range in terms of daily routines, household tasks, getting around, using public transport, intimate relationships. You'll see 64% and 35%. So again, very important areas, and doing things for relaxation and pleasure. In terms of employment, the great majority of people were employed before their spinal cord injury, but only 29% were currently in paid employment at the time of the survey. About half of those had gone back to work in the first year, but you'll see that there's a long tail, and there were people that were still taking 5 years or longer to get back to work. And the reasons for people not currently working included health conditions or disability in 2/3. So a lot of those problems that we were looking at before, pain, problems with bladder and bowel, a whole range of health issues contributing to that, fatigue and so on. Not being able to find suitable work, and importantly, fear of losing a disability pension. So being disincentivized to return to work. And we'll come back to that, touch on that in terms of a policy aspect. In terms of the environment, so financial issues, lack of insurance, problems with access. So you'll see over 50% in family and friends' homes, but also public access. In terms of, again, lack of transportation in about 1/3. Climate, so climate change, is affecting us all, but for people with spinal cord injury who have autonomic dysfunction and problems with regulating body temperature and other functions, it's having an even bigger impact. Assistive mobility devices, negative societal attitudes, so family and friends as well as society in 20 to 30%. Communication devices, care and support in about 20%. So lots of things there to think about in terms of how we might target policy, regulation, or enforcement of accessibility standards, funding for equipment and services, and so on. I guess one of the good things to note was that the majority of people actually had good or very good quality of life. However, a small minority had poor or very poor quality of life, and about a quarter were somewhat undecided. And in terms of, again, on the EQ5D, but some of the domains of satisfaction here, people were, had satisfied or very satisfied in about 50% in terms of physical health and psychological health, but more satisfied with personal relationships and their living conditions. You'll note at the bottom, of course, that in terms of the SF36, in terms of emotional well-being, vitality, but also mental health, that people are scoring very much lower than the population norms. So that's important. So in terms of trying to explain these results, we're certainly in the process of publishing them in the scientific literature, and there's a number of the international studies were published at the end of last year in the Archives of Physical Medicine, and some of our studies have started to be published just in the last couple of months. But we're also developing, lay summaries, and these are very important in terms of our next steps, in terms of translation and better understanding of what to do next. We're developing snippets, videos, plain language text, infographics to, again, be used in workshops, to be part of, go up on our website. And in terms of now then trying to understand the results. So what do the results mean? How can we act on them? So we're in the process of currently running 6 focus groups, and certainly that's involving the Hopkins Institute, and I'll come back to that at the end. So 6 focus groups with people with spinal cord injury in different states. So we're running them across the different states with the assistance of the spinal cord injury associations. We're also planning to run 1 focus group with all of the spinal cord injury associations in Australia. We're using a nominal group technique, and we're focusing currently on these key issues that have popped up. So in terms of employment, in terms of people's experience of pain, and also bladder, bowel and sexual dysfunction. And we're, finding and feeding back those results, and then feeding them in to the next step. And this is just a quick look to show you. So this is from the focus group on employment, and these are the ideas, are some of the ideas here that were generated by the group in terms of facilitating flexible work practices, and starting the process of return to work, maintaining connectivity with the workplace and the employer, that sort of early liaison, which we know is so important. And you'll see using the nominal group technique there that people have rated that first one more highly than the second one in terms of actions. And these were 2 of a number of activities that were reflected back to the group, and then scored and rated and prioritised. And we'll feed into further work in terms of then what to do next. So in terms of next steps, thinking about how to design implementation activities, we're looking at running workshops and stakeholder dialogues, a bit like the McMaster model for policy dialogue, and stakeholder dialogue for policy development. So looking at, improving interventions, for instance, in pain or spasticity or sexual dysfunction, or fatigue management, educational materials to support that, self-management apps. So we're also developing an app at the moment with self-management, with modules to support self-management in people with spinal cord injury. Looking at what we might be able to change in terms of public policy and starting those dialogues and connecting with the right sort of levels of policymakers and so on. And obviously thinking about more targeted research. So where to go next. Some of these things are really just, the tip of the iceberg. Here's an example of thinking about employment, for instance. So some of our research has highlighted this also in the discussions. People are on different trajectories. Their transitions and drivers to, return to work are different depending on whether they're what we call a return to work or a new start, need, retraining, more education, all of those sort of things. So thinking about those sort of things, as I said, looking at modifiable factors or those barriers to employment. So we know education and training is a key enabler, but some of those health-related issues that are major barriers, as well as the problems with transportation and access to driving, are also key environmental barriers. And also, those putting systems in place to support people once they're back in work. And as I said, also looking to advocate for policy changes that would allow for more flexible work practices, supported employment, reduced hours, access to income support, for instance, so people are not disincentivised to lose, their disability support, pension, etc. So just to sum up, I guess, there are many aspects to the lived experience. Here I've just tried to develop a bit of a model that, we're, I guess, evolving at the moment, but to say, that there are many aspects of the person's health and well-being, their social participation and the environment, and their personal factors that affect the lived experience. So the person's health, their functioning and independence, their ability to work and participate in society and their social activities, but also their autonomy, their sense of belonging and being part of the community, the interpersonal relationships that we've highlighted are so important for quality of life. And on the right there, of course, the environment in terms of the systems, the services, the policies, the social attitudes and social support, which we know is so important, built environment, assistive technology, transportation and finances are all a key part of that. So I'd just like to finish by thanking my collaborators. And so Dr. Delina Amsters, Dr. Samantha Borg, and Professor Tim Geraghty from the Hopkins Centre up there, who were key collaborators from Queensland as one of the states in our study, but also now working very closely with myself and my postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Aurora, to look at translating these results into practice and hopefully changes that make a difference to people with spinal cord injury. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Kelsey Chapman from the Hopkins Center. I am the academic research lead of the Dignity Project and a PhD candidate, and I'm here today on behalf of our team. For those of you who don't know, the Dignity Project aims to embed dignity in the way we work, the way we build things, and the way we treat people to disrupt business as usual for people with disability. And we do this through citizen science research, ongoing engagement with the community through our community hub, and strategic partnerships and grants. Now today I'm going to talk to you about our recent research into dignity for people with disability within travel and mobility systems. Just to give you a bit of context, the UN Physical Accessibility Survey came out recently, which highlighted the fact that 53% of educational facilities, 31% of public toilets, 32% of public transport, and 20% of hospitals are not physically accessible to people without typical mobility. And this is the context in which we started our work. Now, public transport and mobility and travel systems can be a bridge that enables people with disability to move freely and participate in society through employment, education, socialization, and the receipt of services. However, a lack of access to transport and constrained personal mobility can lead to social exclusion, social isolation, loneliness, poverty, poor physical and mental health, and deprivation. In Australia, more than 30% of people with disability experience difficulties using public transport. So to decrease the prevalence of these challenges and eliminate the barriers to personal mobility for people with disability, it's important to examine the interaction between travel and mobility experiences and perceptions about dignity. And so that's what we did in a 12-month project. Now, some of our key findings highlighted that dignity, as defined in the research, is the acknowledgement of people with disability as humans with value, agency, and preferences, which then requires the delivery of human rights in ways that are responsive and respectful to those preferences. We also uncovered that there are 3 critical enablers for mobility and travel for a dignified experience for people with disability. 1, universally designed environments and conveyances that are inclusive and accessible to a range of diverse impairments. 2, in the absence of a universally accessible environment, we recognize that not every system can scrap it all and build back better. Information became the critical enabler, and that was information that was inclusive, accessible, accurate, transparent, and consistent. And this helped people with disability to set the expectation of how the travel or mobility system might function, and then enabled them to make choices about how they may wish to engage or not engage with that system. We also found that people with disability, in order to maintain their own dignity, did an immense amount of pre-planning before travel in order to, again, set the expectation for how they might use the system. Now, sometimes that was delivered in reality and sometimes it wasn't, and this can determine whether an experience is dignified or not. And that's all we have time for today. We hope you can apply some of these findings to your research and ultimately look us up on the Hopkins Center website. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Grace and I'm a research fellow here at the Hopkins Center in the Positive Environments and Communities stream. All the work that we are doing in this stream is underpinned by the social model of disability, which sees disability as resulting from interactions and mismatches between individuals and their environment. In particular, we see the built environment as having the potential to be either a disabling or enabling force in individuals' lives, allowing them to live with dignity and participate fully in the community. One particular problem that we're grappling with is the shortage of accessible supported housing in our communities, and our research is addressing this in several ways. Firstly, we're looking at the problem of how to create more accessible housing. The Disability Accommodation Landscape Project is trying to better understand the current disability accommodation marketplace, where there are problems with supply and demand, and speaking to stakeholders about what they see as the challenges and opportunities in the market. This work is highlighting the many barriers that individuals face in trying to obtain accommodation which meets their needs. The flip side of this coin is looking at how we can make the existing housing stock that we have more accessible. This is being addressed through the Valuing Home Modification Project, which has consulted with professionals who help people in undertaking home modifications, getting their experience and insights into what they see as valuable and also how a home modification might be seen to represent value for money. The second stage, which is currently underway, is speaking to individuals and their families about what they value in home modifications. And I'm going to insert a shameless plug in here. If you're interested in or have undertaken a home modification, we would love to speak to you. We're trying to capture a really diverse range of perspectives. So please feel free to email. Michaela will put my details in the chat and they're also on the final slide. This diagram just overviews how this work fits together and highlights some of the opportunities we've had to feed this work back into the practical and policy space. For example, through my participation in the NDIA reference group for specialist disability accommodation. We were also really excited to be part of the Building Better Homes campaign, which successfully saw the introduction of minimum accessibility standards into the building code late last year. This campaign is still ongoing and we are hopeful that the few remaining states that have not adopted the legislation will do so in the near future. We're looking forward to continuing this work also through new collaborations and grants that are just beginning, so please don't hesitate to reach out if you're interested in hearing more or participating in our research. Thank you.
So today I'm joined by Dr. Gary Allen, the CEO of Enabled.VIP, to talk to us about dignified participation in employment structures. So Gary, what does that mean and what does that look like?
I mean, I think the reality in modern Australian life is work is such a big part of what we do. So I think being involved in employment is incredibly important for sense of self-worth, dignity and social connection. I think that it needs to be not only an employment opportunity, it's an ability to make a meaningful contribution. It should be structured in a way that accommodates the needs of a person and recognises the contribution they can make.
And what would you say for someone who that system's not working for them? Would you suggest that they turn to entrepreneurship?
Look, I'm a big fan of the potential for disability entrepreneurship. If you put Australia side by side with a few other countries around the world, although people with a disability are more entrepreneurial, it's not to the same degree they are overseas. I think that, that happens because people want to structure their working life and day and the type of work they're doing to fit their disability. So I think disability entrepreneurship is a great option for people, and it's a way to actually make a not only useful impact, but hopefully make a contribution to their own income and circumstance.
Great, and you're an entrepreneur yourself at Enabled.VIP. So tell us a bit about that and what the work you do is all about.
Okay, so I mean, it really came about because a colleague of mine, Cole Chandler, and I attended a few disability employment events, and it was all focused on the sort of, excuse me if I sound arrogant and pompous, but the sort of sheltered workshop end of employment. Which is fine. But I mean, when you're talking about progressive conditions, or if you're talking about something like TBI, a person maybe has got considerable expertise and skills, and so you want work that actually fits their expertise, recognises contribution. So I think disability entrepreneurship allows a person to actually structure their circumstance to their needs and their setup. So I mean, I think it's just a really powerful alternative, and it's not hard.
And what's the next 6 months look like for enabled.vip?
So we're currently running a pilot test of the program. So we've got 10 Australians going through the process. We use that pilot test just to test our systems. And we've got a couple of great people coming through the program, a couple that are, quite frankly, intimidating in terms of how good their ideas are.
Great. Well, thank you so much and look forward to hearing more about it soon.
Yeah, great stuff.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, Grace and Gary. Please put your questions and answers, or questions and comments, in the question and answers portal during the presentations, and the presenters will get back to you after the event. We're now going to go to a brief break again as we transition to the next section. Thank you. Welcome to topic 2, opportunities for dignified participation to improve mental health and wellbeing, a systemic perspective. We're going to first hear from Associate Professor Jennifer Smith-Mary, followed by lightning talks from Mr. Tim McCallum and Dr. David Bork. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Okay, over to me. Hi, everyone. I'm greeting you today from the lands of the Gundungurra and Darug people up here in Katoomba, but I'm delighted to be with the Hopkins Centre at Griffith University, which is where I was an undergraduate student in the mid-90s, straight out of school. So I'm going to talk to you today. I'm going to go out to the macro level and talk about this dignity in relation to systems and social institutions and the way that they enhance or do not enhance dignity and the way that decisions are made at a policy level. So I'm not going to read this, but for those of you who can't see the slides, I just have a slide up of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability and the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which have, as Graeme said, a strong impetus on dignity. What I want to do is I want to tie dignity to participation and voice. So the fact that in order to have dignity and participate in our social institutions, in order to make changes into systems, then people need to be seen and heard. So participation is really an important part of dignity. So participation can only be enacted and policy enacted with a full understanding of the experiences and needs of people with disability. And in fact, the UN CRPD emphasises consultation, that dignity can't be realised without participation in the way that systems are done. Now, I'm talking about mental health systems in my presentation, but you can actually just transpose any type of system or policy making. And we know, of course, that mental health systems and that mental health policy and disability policy are increasingly together since the advent of the NDIs in Australia. So dignity is therefore inextricably linked to voice if we take it back to those human rights. But I want to take you back even further to before the human rights principles. This is a picture here. I've got a picture up on the screen of Willowburn Asylum, which was up at Toowoomba. This was where my great uncle was a patient in the early 1900s. He had epilepsy and he was classed as insane. He was very much separated from the rest of the world. And so this is there's some flowery quotes here from the Truth newspaper about Willowburn, which is quite, I think, describes the situation quite well. The Willowburn colony of exiles, the compulsory home of those pitiable outcast beings whose weak mentality has caused them to be segregated from the rest of the world. So this real lack of presence in the world. Now, when actually Harold was at Willowburn, which later became the sort of notorious Bailey Henderson facility and is still in operation in Toowoomba today, the Inspector of Asylums was actually influenced by the moral treatment regime of William Tuke and his Quaker Run York retreat, which actually had a very strong emphasis on dignity. And wanted individuals to be seen as human beings with individual treatment needs. So there was a individualized focus. However, the type of dignity that enabled was only within the institutions and the sort of policy regimes that we had during that period, which meant that while he might have had voice within his own environment, there was no voice for people with mental illness or disability beyond that. There was no public voice. So it wasn't valid in broader social and policy regimes. Now I'll get to the point in the middle. I suppose I'll get to the point now, but we have this history of systemic practices which have devalued the voice of people with mental illness and people with disability more generally. And the social stigma that exists continues to devalue that voice. And that is a significant problem in implementing dignity more broadly in our society. Our mental health systems are meant to be about care, control, and health promotion. But this element of control is a sort of elephant in the room when it comes to mental illness, because our policies are often about coercion and control, and it's very, very difficult to then put dignity alongside that. Voice is an essential part of dignity from a procedural justice perspective, and within those types of policy regime, it becomes very, very difficult in order to enact voice and in a way that we can even point to and say is dignity. So in terms of policy, I'm going to explain this this slide, but it is actually really essential that we hear from people with disability, because what we find is that policymakers are not that great at estimating what the needs and interests of people with disability actually are. So therefore, voice is essential in that. So this slide here is of a piece of research that we've just only recently completed, which is about the priorities of people with disability and other people involved in disability services, disability policy across Australia. We surveyed around 1,000 people, and what we found was that a large part of the disability community had the same sorts of priorities, but the group that was quite off was government employees, that they had a different set of priorities for the way that disability research should happen. So they weren't estimating really well. They weren't a good reflection of what the rest of the disability community wanted. And that makes voice essential, because the voice of people with disability within policy making essential, because if we don't have that voice, they're just going to keep thinking that they know what people's needs are and being off the mark. So we have a range of practices that are used in policy making in order to enable voice at the moment. So we have advisory committees are used a lot. So high-level disability advisory committees in relevant areas of policy. But they're sort of patchy in that sometimes they're not well embedded within the structures of policy making. They sort of sit to the side, where they're used for some aspects, but not integral to decision making. Actually, a good example of it being done well is the Independent Advisory Council on the NDIS, which recently had an involvement in the independent assessments, overturning that decision. And so that was a good example of their voice having a strong role, except that doesn't happen very often in the context of the actual overall operation of the NDIS. And those types of advisory committees, yeah, it's patchy. You don't know whether they're going to be tokenistic in the terms of government saying, yes, we are consulting, or not. The other way is employing experts by experience. So this is a really important strategy. So having people with disability in key roles within organisations, and Graeme was talking about this too, that in the NDIS, and we obviously keep going back to that because of the importance of that for disability policy enactment in Australia. There is a diminishing number of people with disability in core positions throughout the organisation. But again, as also Graeme was saying, people is just one voice, and you can't represent all people, the experience of all people with mental illness or disability. Often you get certain groups of people with disability or certain groups of people with mental illness who just are not included at all because of the type of impairments they might have, and that policy structures are very bad at changing themselves to be accessible. The other part that we often get people embedded in policy is through structured consultation processes. So there's an aim that through these structured consultation processes, people with disability, people with mental illness will have their views heard, and that it will shape the policy. Now, in our research, we found that actually you can have these consultation processes and they never actually feed it. That knowledge never feeds into the resulting policy. So it's not, people put a lot of effort and a lot of, writing submissions and those types of things, but they actually, the policymakers will still pick and choose the things that they think are important rather than the things that the people with disability that they're consulting with are important. And sometimes they'll just won't even bring them into the policy. It's not even clear why those processes are happening. But they are good for amplifying advocacy and disabled people's organisation interests because those people, those organisations already can engage with the policy language that policymakers understand. Public forums and events are probably the least able to influence policy, but are good for understanding public sentiment and sentiment in general. But something I've often seen at these events is that policymakers present are unable to deal with the sort of emotion and different ways of communicating that people at those forums have. So there's this real disconnect between the way that policies, the way that systems are developed, and the language and interests and voices of people with disability. And I was really struck by what Kevin said when he opened today, when he talked about there being a world of mirrors where inclusion is an illusion. And I feel that in the way that our systems are developed, all of this policy toolkit that I'm talking about, it might work, but it's really up to the sort of values and the values and contexts. Sorry, I've gone off. I've gone in the wrong direction. What I'm trying to say is that voice is very essential to dignity, except that systems are patchy in their ability to hear voices. That we need voices to be validated, and there needs to be an underpinning belief system within these social institutions that will promote dignity. The UNCRPD is an important sort of belief system and other rights-based approaches. They are really, really useful at promoting a particular value that can underpin the type of inclusion that policy and systems are doing, but without a really strong belief system like that sitting beneath that toolkit that we have for policy inclusion, then it's going to go on being sort of a patchy landscape where sometimes we hear voices and sometimes we don't, and therefore dignity is not being realised within our policy systems. So I suppose I was meant to come up with some bold ideas, but instead I've just talked about a lot of the problems with the current operation of policy systems. I suppose the bold idea then is that we need to have a very strong values underpinning the way that we do inclusion within those policy systems, or we're just not going to realise inclusion. And I'm going to leave my discussion there.
Life seems to go on without effort when I am filled with music. An inspiring quote by the 18th century poet George Eliot. The goal of the Singing Chords project is to utilise the power of music and singing to increase the independence and well-being of those living with a spinal cord injury. Here are some observations and stories about our Singing Chords project. Let's face it, singing in public is sometimes people's worst fear. So how did we alleviate the uncomfortableness and worries of participants? Well, we made sure that the environment was safe and welcoming. Participants and researchers were all involved in icebreakers, silly vocal warm-up games, and even giving ourselves bird nicknames to fit in with the Singing Songbirds theme. And before you all think it, yes, I was the bald eagle of the flock. Now, certain songs had a huge impact on the emotional well-being of the participants. Strong feedback was that there needed to be more upbeat and positive vibe songs. So more Pharrell Williams happy than Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On. Although two songs which have become almost anthems for Singing Chords have been What a Wonderful World and Lean on Me, which I believe says a lot about the impact of positive lyrics in song choices. Dignity also comes in the form of choice. So we gave choice to the participants around some of the song selections. So we had a broad range of participant demographics, so there was an even broader variety of musical interests. So we sang everything from James Brown, I Feel Good, to Guy Sebastian's Quiet, to the Commitments, Mustang Sally, to Avicii's Hey Brother. Now, one of the best decisions that we had made, and that had an unintentional effect on the health and well-being of participants, was the incorporation of combining both inpatient and community participants. It was a truly peer-led and peer-supported project. Those with a spinal cord injury included myself as co-lead researcher, a peer support officer from Spinal Life Australia as a participant, and we had 4 community participants. And the benefits of that type of social connection was immeasurable, but we could see the direct effect it had on the inpatients and their ability to normalize their injury. Now, singing in a group is much less confronting and scary than on your own, right? Well, we saw great camaraderie and encouragement of each other, especially on the days where patient participants were having a really tough time. And the community participants often provided a peer support-like encouragement to the patients, which in turn created a togetherness and a strong group morale. Now, in an emotional conversation I had with a patient, she expressed how sad she was about losing her laugh emotionally and physically. Her laugh had changed. She felt like her laugh was an alien voice inside of her. And by welcoming her into the Singing Chords fold, we were able to provide her a safe environment for her to learn how to cope with her new sound, teaching her how to control a little more of the oxygen intake and outflow. And along with the joyful banter and camaraderie exerted by the group, her 15 facial muscles started to contract, and the old zygomatic major muscle began to create that smile that had been missing since her injury. Early on in the Singing Chords project, a participant gave us probably the strongest and most flowery feedback about what singing chords meant for him. It remains one of our most proudest outcome measures yet. And to quote this patient's exact words, "This is better than any of the fucking medication they've given me here so far." Well, 18th century George Eliot would not have phrased it that way, but by helping fill this gentleman's day with a little bit of music, his life was moving on with a little less effort and a lot more fun. Well done, Timo.
A research fellow here at the Hopkins Centre, where I work on a longitudinal project